G'day guys, ZiggyD here. ZiggyD announced yesterday that Path of Exile is going to be coming to Xbox One later this year. Chris said that the console port will be including the 3.0 Act 5 expansion, so it's quite likely I think that it's going to be releasing alongside of it in order to build off of that hype. ZiggyD released a pretty kick-ass looking trailer alongside of development manifesto, a few interviews and some posts on Reddit talking about the development process for this, how things are going to be moving forward, and also addressing some of the concerns that the community has about how it's going to affect the existing PC version and PC players. Now, there has been some pretty heated discussion, and I think in some cases outrage, in regards to this announcement, in particular how it's going to be affecting the PC version of the game, and some people claiming the end of days. Now, while I do think some of the responses have been a little bit over the top, I do actually have some of my own concerns about this, and I think that some of the community concerns that have been voiced are pretty legitimate and worth discussing. Now, before I dive into the discussion of some of these concerns, I want to talk about the facts that we know so far. First up, so this progress and development has been in place since 2014, so this is not something that ZiggyD is just saying now at the start of its development process. It's mostly ready. I've actually personally known about this since August last year. Obviously, I had to sign an NDA, and this was pretty top secret, actually. I was very, very expressly told that this particular thing was very, very secret. And I think the reason for that is because the ZiggyD didn't want to announce this, or even mention this at all, until they were sure that they could pull it off. Overall, I think that ZiggyD is pretty aware of the history of console ports in the action RPG genre in general, and also pretty aware that there would be some serious concerns voiced by the community on its announcement, and I think that's one of the big reasons why they wanted to wait until this was a sure thing. Some of the other important pieces of information that have been talked about, mentioned on PC Invasion by Chris Wilson, was that PC patches would be released as soon as they're ready. This is an important point because patch parity has been difficult for people to meet in the past. Blizzard promised patch parity with the Diablo 3 console version, but the certification process delayed patches, and that ended up not being able to be possible. Chris mentions that PC patches will be released as soon as they're ready, and that they won't be delayed to meet or match the console version of the game, and I think this is a pretty important point. The next thing is balance. Chris has said that they're happy for the two versions to have separate balance. However, they're going to be attempting to use PC balance as much as possible on consoles, and he says, unless there's a good reason not to. I actually think this is going to be pretty hard to do. We've already seen in the trailer here that there's going to be significant changes. One of the major ones is that there's going to be 4 floss instead of 5. Obviously, that's a lot less power available to players, and that's going to make the game harder, and the game is already fairly hard. Add to that console targeting and precision issues. You just don't have the same precision that you have with a mouse for things like lightning warp and movement skills. I think that the game is going to be a lot harder already, so things like simplifying down, removing a flask, is going to make the game even harder on top of that. So balance is going to have to be different in order for the console version to be reasonably playable for people. Another important point is that controller support will not be coming to the PC version of the game, and this is further example of how the two versions are going to be diverging and are going to be substantially different. Chris said that the changes that they had to make to allow the game to be controlled by a controller make it a different game. He also says that this is an example of their commitment to not changing the PC version due to the existence of the console one. Now that kind of segues nicely into the discussion of one of the first major concerns, this idea that the console version could affect the PC version in a potentially negative light. In particular is this idea that the game could be dumbed down in order to facilitate development of the console version. For example, a mechanic that is too complex might not be considered for the PC version because it won't also be able to be ported over to the console version. And this is a pretty legitimate concern, I think. So let's address that with what we know so far. This version of the game has been in development since 2014. In that time, we've had Forsaken Masters, The Awakening, Ascendancy, and Atlas of Worlds. Now, also in that time, I would say that if anything, the game has gotten more complex overall. And this has been during that period that ZiggyD have known and have been considering development of the console version of the game. Now there's this idea that Path of Exile overall has gotten a lot easier. I think it's pretty important. This is kind of a separate topic. I don't want to get sidetracked too much here, but I think it's a pretty important point to discuss before discussing how the console version will affect it and the idea of dumbing down. Now, the base content of Path of Exile or the leveling process in early endgame has gotten a lot easier over the past 2 years. That fact cannot be disputed at all. However, at the same time, the game has gotten more complex and has had harder challenges added to it in that time as well. Back when Path of Exile was an extremely hard game, as people say, we never had anything nowhere near as hard as the Guardians and the Shaper fight. So what has actually happened to Path of Exile over time is that as actual endgame content was added to the game and high-end content for experienced players to engage with has been added, the core game, or the earlier sections of the game, the leveling and the early endgame process, have gotten easier and more accessible to more players. I mean, this only makes sense, right? Before we had endgame features, back in beta or back at release, we didn't really have an endgame. We had at release this map system that just didn't kind of go anywhere. You just ran maps to run maps and hopefully get some good gear, but there wasn't really much of an end game there. So as a result, the rest of the game had to be harder and more challenging to kind of slow players' progression down so that they wouldn't reach and dominate that end game as quickly, right? There wasn't as much for them. There wasn't as high a ceiling for them to engage with. So although some parts of the game have gotten easier over the past 2 years, other parts have been added that are very difficult, challenging, and complex. So my point is that this has been the period that the console development of the game has been in the forefront of ZiggyD's mind this entire time. And during that period, we've had complex and challenging game mechanics added to the game. So based on what we've seen so far, it seems that the game hasn't been simplified too much on the PC version of it with the console in mind. Now, Chris mentioned in the PC Invasion interview that the lack of controller support for PC was an example of their commitment to not changing the PC version due to the existence of the console one. Now, sorry Chris, but I do draw issue with this particular statement, and I think that it could be a little bit misleading. Because I think it's impossible that the development of the console version of the game is not going to affect the development of Path of Exile as a whole, including the PC version of the game. I mean, financially speaking, and development time speaking, it doesn't make sense to develop things that couldn't possibly be used on the console. So there has to be some impact of the console version of the game being in the minds of ZiggyD when developing these elements of the game. You have to consider the whole picture, it only makes sense. I don't think we're going to be seeing too many things released on the PC version of the game that won't be released on the console version of the game because they simply can't. I could be proven wrong here. I could be entirely wrong. Maybe ZiggyD releases some skills on PC version that just don't go to the console version of the game. But they also said that they want to try and follow the balance of the PC version as much as possible on the console version. I hope that I'm proven wrong here, but I do think that there's going to be some impact on the PC version of the game from the console. The question is that going to be a negative impact overall? And if we look at the past 2 years, I think the Path of Exile has gotten a lot better overall. I know everyone doesn't agree. Some people consider the game too easy. Some people disagree with certain expansions that have happened in the last 2 years, and I totally understand that. But I think Path of Exile overall is a far better game now, despite our nostalgia, and despite my nostalgia. I really enjoyed beta, but despite that nostalgia, Path of Exile is a far better game now overall. It's more accessible to more people, and also more engaging to the dedicated players as well. I personally feel that some of the recent expansions have been the best ones in Path of Exile's history, and they seem to be getting better and better. I'm very excited for Act 5 on that note. Now, similar to this topic is the idea that skills will have to be dumbed down in order to support the console version of the game. And this is an interesting one because console targeting has to be substantially different. Now, when you have skills like Stormcall or Lightning Warp, things that have precision targeting, how do they translate over to console? Especially with things like Stormcall that have a delay, so you need to aim them very well in order to be able to hit targets, because if there's moving targets, you need to place the mark of a Stormcall so that the mob will move into it. How do you do that on console? This is going to be something we're not going to really get an answer to until we're able to actually play the game. I would love to play the game and see how ZiggyD have addressed this issue, because this is going to be an important point, because if they don't have a good solution to this issue, to make this targeting feel good on console, then it potentially is going to hamper the development of skills for the PC version of the game. Now, there's a lot of really good skills they can do that will translate perfectly over to console. Blade Flurry, a recent new skill that is extremely popular and successful and very fun to play mechanically speaking, would work perfectly on console. It doesn't have any particular targeting, it's more of like a channel and release style skill. It's got kind of like a conal/circle AoE set in front of the character. It's more about how you position your character in relation to the mobs and then how you channel and release, rather than specific aim. Works perfectly on console and is also very fun on PC. However, I do have concerns that if ZiggyD doesn't get this targeting system right on console, that we might not see more skills like Stormcall. Not everyone likes skills like Stormcall, but that sort of precision targeting skills that have specific aim, I think have a place in the game and have a good place in the game as well. So I do really hope that ZiggyD can assuage my concerns when it comes to targeting, and that I really hope that they've nailed this targeting system on console so that we don't see any issues on PC version of the skills not being released that could be released but wouldn't work on console. So the next cluster of topics and concerns that people have been discussing is that ZiggyD have been dedicating resources to the Xbox version of the game instead of addressing existing issues on the PC version of the game. This also kind of ties in with the idea of the financial risk of taking on a console version of the game, and also the history of console ports and how they've affected PC versions in the past, and also some of the failures in the action RPG genre. Now, action RPGs on console are not a new thing. We had Diablo 1 all the way back in the day releasing on PlayStation, for example, and more recently Diablo 3 released on console with pretty decent success. Now, Diablo 3 is an interesting example because that entire game was designed from the ground up with console version in mind, and Path of Exile was not designed from the ground up with console versions in mind. That's something that's been a relatively new idea in the last 2 or so years. It wasn't there from the outset. Then we've had other games like Sacred, which went to consoles and had a very mediocre console version of the game, and a lot of people actually attribute the failure of that company to that mediocre release of a console version of Sacred 2. So there is the issue and the potential risk that the console version of Path of Exile bombs, and that it's a financial blow to the company, and that affects us all, obviously. Now, there's also the flip side of that this works really well. The console version is received very well. A lot of new players join the game, they buy a bunch of MTXs on the consoles, and that the entire company grows as a result. And well, when it comes down to it, this sort of financial risk is not something that we as the community can really discuss all that much. It's something that the company makes, from its board of directors based on the financial information and the risk assessments that they make. We can't really comment on that much. There has been a pretty bad history of action RPG console ports, yes. However, ZiggyD have done some things that other companies have not been able to do very well. They released an extremely niche and complex action RPG. They did it free to play with a Kickstarter style model before a lot of games were doing that, and they did it very well. They absolutely crushed it with some pretty crazy ideas that people didn't think would work. I think I'd like to echo something Moores said in his video actually, that if anyone can pull this off, it's probably Grinding Gear Games. ZiggyD could well pull a rabbit out of the hat in terms of this console port, and they could buck the trend that we've seen so far. And as for the financial risk overall, well, obviously ZiggyD's done their assessments of the risk-reward here, the potential market that they could tap, the risk that it's going to present to the company, whether that's something they can handle if it doesn't do well, and I'd say that they've made the decision with those factors in mind. So in the end, we kind of have to trust that aspect of it. So now we kind of circle back to this idea of ZiggyD dedicating resources to development of the Xbox version of the game instead of addressing existing issues with the PC version. Now there's a couple of points to discuss here. The first is that ZiggyD's investment in developing the console version of the game can and has had positive impacts on the PC version of the game. Liken this to you as a person learning something in a similar industry to what you work in currently. I've been watching Suits recently, so let's say that you're a practicing lawyer and you work in corporate law. You go and do some extra studies and casework in criminal law, and some of the things that you learn from that field end up translating back to improved skills and improved knowledge that benefit your main chosen field of corporate law. Maybe you end up hiring on some extra staff in criminal law into your firm that then help with some corporate law cases that have some criminal elements to them. It's a somewhat arbitrary example, but hopefully it makes a bit of sense here, because that's kind of what happened with ZiggyD. ZiggyD recently hired some people to work on the console version of the game, essentially, to work on some things that would be required for the console version of the game to work, in particular DirectX 11 support. Now, they didn't have those skills or those people with the capabilities that they had and the skill sets and knowledge that they had prior to doing this. If they had not had been considering a console version of the game, would they have hired these specific people? Maybe, but maybe not. Probably not. Now, the DirectX 11 support and some of the performance improvements that we've had on the PC version have been a side effect of working on making the game work on an Xbox One. Because what is an Xbox One? I think Crip actually said this really well. An Xbox One is basically an old computer or a lower performance computer. So in order to optimize the game for lower performance computers, aka the Xbox One, well, they've improved things for people running on actual PCs and people running on lower end PCs and people running on higher end PCs that were having some issues with specific aspects of the game. And we have seen some pretty dramatic performance improvements over the past few expansions. So this is a pretty good example of ZiggyD's investment in the console version of the game already benefiting PC players, and I hope that trend continues, and I suspect it will. I think that ZiggyD will explore things like playability issues in the console. They've mentioned things like getting better tutorials for the console version of the game that could come back to the PC version of the game as well, and I think that we'll see some crossover between the two versions of the game and improvements as a result. The second aspect of this concern about ZiggyD dedicating resources to Xbox instead of the PC version is that the company is investing in the company as well, right? So in expanding to the Xbox, they're trying to reach a larger market, and if they're successful, and ZiggyD obviously believes they will be successful in this, that's going to bring more players that pay more money, that help expand the game overall. And we should then see financial returns, which means that's going to drive future content that's going to benefit both PC and console players. If all of a sudden ZiggyD is getting an extra $1 million a year, then that's potentially another act that they could work on. Getting another act out, or getting another expansion out, or just adding more to the expansions that they release. There's also another kind of interesting angle to this, is that you as content consumers, you're watching this video so you're a content consumer, will also benefit as well, because more eyeballs searching for content means that more people are going to be able to successfully make a living making Path of Exile content, or be more driven and motivated to make more Path of Exile content that you guys will also be able to enjoy. So overall, I'm pretty excited about this. I like to see my favorite company, Grinding Gear Games, taking some risks, making a deep, challenging console action RPG, which is something that the console market really doesn't have much of. That's an interesting risk to take, and one that I would like to see pay off. I would love to see more players playing Path of Exile, and I would also love to see more people watching Path of Exile content. I'm totally on board with ZiggyD taking this risk. I still do share some of your concerns. I'm very keen to see how ZiggyD is handling balance between the two versions, how they're handling skill targeting, and also just how they're going to handle like the monetization and the extra players and marketing this for a new community that they're not used to tapping. That's new untrodden territory for them. I'm cautiously optimistic that this is going to work out. I look forward to seeing more of the console version of the game, seeing how ZiggyD is going to handle the development of this alongside the PC version, and trying the game and just seeing how it feels as well, seeing whether they nailed the transition from a complex PC game over to console, something that a lot of people don't think can be done. Anyway guys, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Please do let me know down in the comments below. This is a pretty interesting topic, and I think we should discuss it until we're all exhausted and tired of the topic. That's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.